Good day, everybody. Today we're going to talk about episode 15, The View from Halfway Down, which, in my view, is one of the most intense half hours of media ever produced anywhere. Um, I'm very curious what you thought of it. I'm very much looking forward to reading the discussion posts and seeing what everybody's reaction to this episode was. There's much more to talk about in here than we're possibly going to get to. If you get really interested in this episode, there are a bunch of YouTube videos that are deep dives that aren't so much focused on the philosophy as we're going to focus on, but are focused on all of the little details and meanings of the whole episode. It's really fascinating how carefully constructed it is. So the basic plot, as you know, is as Bojack lies dying in his pool after his bender, he has a vision where he's surrounded by all of the dead people who played an important role in shaping who he is. Right? He's halfway down in the sense that he's at a point suspended between life and death, and we don't know which way it's going to go. I would argue, and I'll make this argument out in my last lecture too on episode 16, the finale, that in some sense it goes both ways, that he's in a kind of a Schrodinger's cat situation where there's no determinate truth of the matter as to whether he's alive or dead. And this is going to be important later. It's going to turn out that the truth of the matter lies in our interpretation of the scene, just as it does in quantum mechanics. I don't want to make too much out of that analogy, but it is a kind of an interesting analogy to think about. I would mention before we get into the narrative details of the episode that the pictures on the wall in the background are worth pausing and looking at. There's one picture of him already dead in the pool. There's his Narcissus painting. There's a picture of the old Sugarman place. In a way, the pictures are providing a kind of a visual map of his life and of his psyche, and it's worth taking some time to pause the show and look at those in detail. So the first thing that I want to talk about is the dinner conversation that he has that takes up a big chunk of the episode. And there are at least two philosophical movements to that dinner conversation. First, they have a conversation about whether and when death means anything. What does it take to have a meaningful death? And then they have a conversation about what the best and worst moments in their life are. And these are both deeply philosophical conversations. So let's focus on that first conversation, which is it's really about two things. It's about what it is to have a meaningful death, and also when does your life mean something, right? When is there some sort of purpose or meaning that makes your life worthwhile? This is, of course, a key existentialist question. What is the meaning of life? And it's one that we have grazed by several times during this course, but we haven't actually discussed it much, right? The question is, does life, or some lives, do they have an overall worth or value or purpose? And is there a point to death? Is there a time when death is meaningful and worthwhile, or is death always just a meaningless and useless end, right? The alternative is that life might simply be neutral and meaningless regardless. One fun thing to look at before we dive into the different characters' answers to this question is what is everyone eating during this conversation? We see Bojack trying to make his way through a plate filled with pills, pharmaceuticals. Sarah Lynn is munching down on fattening junk food. At least in those two cases, it seems like the characters are eating things that they denied themselves or tried to restrict themselves on during their lives, partly in order to give their life meaning, right? So Bojack tries to give up his addictions in order to give his life meaning and worth. And Sarah Lynn tries to constantly keep herself skinny and attractive by official social standards in order to give her life meaning and worth. It's interesting to think about what the other characters are eating and whether we can give a similar reading of their food. Okay, so the different dinner guests take turn proposing different ways that lives and deaths might have meaning. Bojack's uncle Crackerjack, who died in the war, suggests that it's sacrifice for others that gave his death meaning, and by having a meaningful death, it gave his life meaning. Bojack rejects this answer, saying that if you require sacrificing yourself for others in order to have a meaningful life, then that turns happiness into a selfish act, and that seems wrong. Why is giving up your own happiness somehow better and more meaningful? The thing is that even Crackerjack doesn't really stick to this answer, because over the course of the conversation, he points out that his sacrifice really probably never saved anyone anyhow, or at least he doesn't know that it did. He never actually directly got to help anybody's lives, and yet his was a sacrifice which is seen as noble because it was in the course of a war which is seen as a just war. So the question raised by Crackerjack's death then is sacrifice inherently meaning-making and worthy in its own right? Or does there have to be some separate benefit in order to make that sacrifice valuable and worthwhile, right? Is sacrifice a valuable thing to do regardless of the results of that sacrifice? And I think that's really what Bojack is questioning. He's saying, no, to value sacrifice for its own sake, regardless of its results, is just to buy into an ideology that makes happiness worthless and turns your own happiness into account against you, and that seems unjustified. Sarah Lynn then gives a different twist on this kind of sacrifice. She says she sacrificed her own happiness in order to give pleasure to others, right? It's really quite interesting. She objectified herself in an important way. She turned her body into an object for the pleasure of other people, both through how she looked and through her voice and also through her persona. And she's making the case that objectification might actually be a kind of meaningful self-sacrifice, that she let other people take her as an object and reduced her own selfhood in order to give them pleasure. And she basically asks, why would this be less important than fighting in a noble war and not even saving anyone? At least she can measure, in some sense of measure, right, through record sales and fan adoration and so on, she can measure the pleasure that she gave to other people. So I think there's an interesting kind of antinomy between Crackerjack and Sarah Lynn, right? Both of them sacrificed their own happiness for other people, but in some sense they're opposites. Crackerjack sacrificed himself in a way that we see as socially noble and that we reward and celebrate, even though his sacrifice did not measurably help anybody. Whereas Sarah Lynn sacrificed herself in a way that we commonly treat as degraded and subjugated, right? We look down on people who participate in their own objectification. Sometimes they get slut-shamed. And yet her sacrifice, which is not treated as socially worthy, actually did bring pleasure to people. So there's an interesting question, which of either of those brings meaning to death and sacrifice? Is it the socially valued kind of death, regardless of consequences, or is it the consequences regardless of social value? Herb then gives a different answer altogether, right? He says, no, what gives life meaning is not sacrifice. Bojack's right that we don't have to sacrifice ourselves in order to have meaningful lives and meaningful deaths. What gives life meaning is being authentic and true to yourself. This is an appealing answer in a way, but it's a troubling one for an existentialist, right? Because if an existentialist thinks that there is no true inner self separate from one's actions, then there isn't any separate thing to be authentic to. In which case, being true to yourself and authentic sounds an awful lot like just doing anything the hell that you want to do, which doesn't seem especially meaningful, right? So there's an interesting existential question about whether there really is a useful notion of authenticity that has existential value, or whether authenticity is just a kind of a cover for doing whatever you want and not caring about anything except that. Now, Herb did not lead a particularly damaging life, right? And it was hard for him to do whatever he wanted, because what he wanted was to be gay back in the 90s when that was more difficult to do. And so maybe we don't need to look down on him for doing whatever he wanted, but we also might think that that doesn't especially give his life any kind of deep existential meaning if there's no such thing as the authentic self. The character, who is a combination of Secretariat and Bojack's father, gives, I think, an especially philosophically interesting answer to this question of what makes life and death meaningful. He committed suicide, right? And he says that what makes life meaningful and valuable is being able to control it. And being able to, having self-determination. Sorry, my cat wants in on this video. And part of being able to control your life, he says, an important part of that, is being able to control your own death. So the fact that he chose the moment and means of his own death through suicide, he thinks, shows that his life was a self-determining one, and hence meaningful and valuable. And his death was valuable insofar as he chose it. This is a deeply existentialist view, right? It's a very serious suggestion. If all there is to the self is your own will, and if you think that value comes from exercising your will and controlling your will, then the best way of giving your life meaning is to exercise your will and control it. This is an answer that both Sartre and Nietzsche would have liked a lot. I think that the idea that controlling your own death is a central part of controlling your own life is a really important philosophical suggestion. I'm not saying whether it's right or wrong, but it's philosophically important. It's actually come up very concretely in the context of debates over the legalization in the United States and elsewhere, but particularly in the United States, of physician-assisted suicide. When you do studies of the people who choose physician-assisted suicide, contrary to what some people expect, it turns out that most people who want physician-assisted suicide, it's not because they want an end to unbearable physical pain. And it's not because they want an end to physical suffering. It's because they feel out of control and they want control. What they care about is autonomy. And in fact, a lot of people in states where physician-assisted suicide is legal, once they go through the process and they get the right to physician-assisted suicide, then they decide that they don't need to exercise that right. It's knowing that they have that control available to them, which turns out to be really the important thing. As you may know, the first state to legalize physician-assisted suicide back in the 90s was Oregon, and with their Death with Dignity Act, and that was challenged by the Supreme Court, which was then the Supreme Court, that was challenged at the level of the Supreme Court under the Bush administration that opposed that law. And at the time, when they were defending the law against the federal level challenge, a bunch of philosophers got together and wrote what's called the Philosopher's Brief, defending the moral and legal validity of physician-assisted suicide. And one of their three key arguments was exactly the argument that Secretariat gives. Their argument was that the right to control your own death is a central part of your fundamental constitutional right to privacy, because the constitutional right to privacy has been interpreted in other Supreme Court cases as basically a right to control the basic narrative of your life. So it includes things like the right to control your reproductive freedoms, because whether you have a kid or don't have a kid is essential to the basic narrative of your life. So that counts as part of your right to privacy. That was part of what was used to justify Roe v. Wade, for instance. I don't want to get off on too much of a tangent. The point is, these philosophers argued that the right to control how your life ends through death is absolutely central to your right to control the basic narrative of your life altogether. And so, how that life ends is an essential part of the basic narrative, and hence it should be a constitutionally protected right. So this is a bioethical argument that supports Secretariat's insight that what really made his life his and made it valuable was that he could control how it ends. This is interesting to contrast with Herb, going back to Herb, who didn't commit suicide. And he says that he didn't commit suicide because the Knicks were having a good season and he wanted to see how the season ended. they all tease him for this. They're like, this is such a trivial thing. So are you saying that if the Knicks had a bad season, you would have killed yourself? And he says, yeah. So in some ways, controlling your own death or life over something so trivial feels very shallow and like the opposite of a worthy, meaningful, purposive life or death. But if this question about the purpose of life is one that's hard to answer, then maybe this is as good of a reason as any, right? If all that matters is that you act by expressing your will and being a self-determining being, then maybe it doesn't matter what your reason is for dying or not dying, as long as you're the one in control. So this kind of absurdist version of the point is on the table as a possibility too. Notice that Bojack does not participate in this conversation. He hasn't died yet, quite, so he can't talk about the meaningfulness of his own death. And he doesn't yet, at this point, have any sense of the meaningfulness or the worth of his own life. He's been struggling to find that for the whole series. So for this part of the conversation, he really doesn't have any answer to the question on the table, and he just listens. Okay, I'll pause there and then continue.